Welcome to the History Nerds and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. We have reached the end of season 3. Thank you, anyone who has listened even one time. I wanted to go out with a bang to end the year strong. Elizabeth Reese in her book Marquis de Lafayette returns. Anybody who reads the blog know I'm a huge nerd for Lafayette. I finally found somebody who would just completely nerd out with me about him. Elizabeth did it. I had so much fun with this conversation. The book is also fantastic. It's about when he comes back after the revolution and basically there's no way to explain how insane the United States went to see him. We're going to talk about exactly what that looked like and what it compares to today. Final note for everybody, we are going to be back January 15th with Season 4. Mark Galeotti is going to return to talk to us about the history of Russian wars. Can't wait for that. But before we get there, let's talk to Elizabeth. And here we are with author Elizabeth Reese. Marquis de Lafayette returns, a tour of America's national capital region. Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
So, Elizabeth, you're who I want to be when I grow up. Could you just tell me kind of what's your day job and what are some of the other history-related things that you have done for work?
Well, I am who I wanted to be when I grew up as a kid, too. So that's fantastic. So I am a public historian. I've been working in the field of public history for over a decade now. My undergraduate was in theater, and I decided my senior year that I was like, oh, maybe I should have majored in history. But I found the field of public history that kind of combines theater and history, where it's I think the most accessible and easy definition of public history is when you go on a tour of a historic house museum and you have a guide that's explaining the history of the site and the relevance of the site and the people who live there, what it means, what it meant in history in the past and what it means today. They're kind of your historical translators in a way, sort of a middle ground between academic and just sort of the general public. So I started off giving tours at Alexander Hamilton's house in Harlem in New York in 2013. And right as the Hamilton mania wave was sort of cresting over. After that, I was a tour guide at the United States Capitol building for 5 years. So if you went on a Capitol tour and you had a red coat guide, that was me. I was doing that. And now I am the associate manager of marketing at Woodlawn and Pope Leahy House in Northern Virginia. Woodlawn was the home of Nellie Custis, George Washington's step-granddaughter. And there's also a Frank Lloyd Wright house on the property. So it's a really unique space just down the road from Mount Vernon.
Now, you jumped ahead, so I had a question at the very end, but you already mentioned it. Hamilton, since now I know you can grade it from both ways, please grade it as theater and grade it as history. Go.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so theater, I think it is fantastic in what it is artistically, how it got people interested in history. We saw a huge influx at Hamilton's house, going from maybe 20 visitors on a Saturday if we were lucky to 1,000 overnight. So that was amazing. I think as history, I have to separate entertainment and history. I'm actually a very good critic of entertainment history, like miniseries and things like that, because I understand this is not what academic history is trying to accomplish. It's something different. You can't equate them as the same. There are some things that I'm okay, that's not entirely accurate, but kind of have to hope that people will find out the answer, or maybe they'll visit a site that will help explain the answer for them if they're not so keen on picking up a book.
I'm going to have two controversial things that I say in this podcast. I already know it, so I'm going to get into one right now. I watched Hamilton, and as far as the zeitgeist that it caused, right, there's no question, and like you said, it made people interested in history, and that's wonderful. But I'm going to sound like such a theater dork right now, but it's fine. I'm going to do it. I watched it, and I'm kind of like, this isn't Les Mis, though. Right? This isn't transcendent as far as art is concerned, but for what it is, I think it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Am I just a crankety old man who just doesn't get it?
No, I don't think so. I think if art does not give differing opinions and have people feel really strong one way and really strong the other way, then I don't think it's accomplishing what it's supposed to do. So that's a fine answer.
That's a very political answer. Congratulations. That was fantastic how you just weaved right in between there.
It's my capital training.
All right, so let's get to the man himself. I'm so excited about this. I told you, the Marquis I find to be the most interesting man basically ever. And anyone who has read the blog is probably sick of me, but I finally have somebody else to bounce my ideas off. Do you remember the first time you heard about the Marquis?
Yes.
When was it?
So I grew up in a very small town in central Maryland. No one's ever heard of it, but the 144, like the historic high national road, goes through my town. And during his national tour, Lafayette was going from Baltimore to Frederick, Maryland. And that road is the road he took. And he stopped in my town and had breakfast. And they had a little reception or parade kind of pass through as he was on his way to Frederick. And there's a little marker next to the house that he supposedly stopped at for breakfast. That's still there. And that was the first time I really heard his name. Flash forward to college, and when I was taking classes about the American history, then I started learning more about him. And then when I started working at Hamilton's house, he became really, really prevalent with his friendship with Hamilton. He's always kind of been, I always say, he's like kind of in the background of every historic place that I've worked. In the background of the Grange, Hamilton's house, he's in the background of the Capitol. I found he was someone, and this is also Hamilton musical is another reason why people really know his name now. But when I would talk about in the rotunda, the sandstone floor, the rotunda was completed for his visit in 1824. So when visitors were standing there, they were standing on the same sandstone floor that Lafayette stood on when he came to the Capitol building in 1824. The portrait of him in the House chamber, there's only two portraits in the House chamber. One is George Washington and one is Lafayette. The one of Lafayette he gave to Congress when he came to visit, so people loved hearing about him. And then my current job at Woodlawn, he stayed at Woodlawn multiple times during his national tour. So he's kind of always been in the background, but it definitely wasn't until I started working at Hamilton's house that I really became a lot more interested in him. And I had a cat named Lafayette at one point too.
I love this. I love this episode so much already. This is what I have in my head. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I don't have enough talent to do it. His life is the perfect miniseries. And here's the thing. You've got season 1, right? You take young Lafayette because you've got the loss. Because unlike myself, who my biggest financial mistake in my entire life was not being born into a rich family, he did the exact opposite, was born into a rich family, but was basically orphaned a whole bunch and quickly becomes, before he's even, 10 or 11 years old, one of the richest people in the world, right?
Yeah, I say that his life could not be, if you presented his life to a movie producer, like, oh, here's a story that I have. It's unbelievable how he's just was born into this remarkable position, how he uses this remarkable position, and how he lives his remarkable life for a single man that existed. Like sometimes I have to remind myself that he was real and he did these things. And I'm the last person to put historical figures on pedestals. I think it's so important to look at them for who they are. But there's something about him that has really transcended like through the centuries and still makes him so lovable today. I love referring to him as America's golden retriever because he is just so energetic. He is so gregarious. And I've read a lot of letters of historical figures. I'd like to say when people say, like, explain your job in a creative way, that I just read dead people's mail. But his are like the only ones that you can feel his personality like in his writing. And especially if you're reading digitized versions of his actual handwritten letters, like the way he writes is just so energetic. And you just really don't see that from a lot of his contemporaries. They're just so acutely aware that they're being studied that he's like, I don't care. Like, this is how I feel. I'm so excited to see you. And you're just like, oh, you just can't help but like diving in right next to him and like going along for the ride, which is so unique.
I mean, his passion for everything just won over so many people because you're talking about George Washington, and we're skipping ahead a little bit, but he ends up in America buying his own way. He's at the same time so utterly clueless about what he's doing. He's very easily led. So while both you and I are on the same page, he is so lovable and absolutely a golden retriever is the perfect metaphor. He's also easily led. But he pays for a boat. He defies the king, maybe on purpose, maybe not. Maybe somebody told him something, whatever. But he shows up in America, and this is a time where foreign officers are already too obnoxious. They're showing up all the time. And somehow his passion, the way he loves everyone and everything in liberty, he wins over the hardest person to win over in the United States of America, which is George Washington. And can you just talk about, I love this line where they are reviewing the soldiers and Washington says something. I want you to say it. Can you just, this line is one of my favorites.
So they're reviewing soldiers and Washington is kind of like talking about the position that they're in. And Lafayette says to him, I am here to learn, not teach. And like this moment of humility is something that is so unexpected because you have all these French officers who are like, no, I'm here for the money. I'm here for the title. I'm here to boss people around, essentially. And Lafayette is just so humble and it's like, this cause is so much greater than myself. And I'm here to lend whatever services that I can and to learn from you. And this is really striking towards Washington. And I really think that this is the moment that Washington is like, oh, maybe this kid has something. And to not only like win over George Washington, he becomes exceptionally close to George Washington, where he notoriously didn't like being touched. He didn't like people kind of being so casual with him, where Lafayette kind of breaks those social boundaries with him. He embraces him publicly. They share a blanket together when they are sleeping after Monmouth, I believe. And it's a certain closeness that Washington doesn't have with other people that he has with Lafayette that makes Lafayette so unique as well.
Now, hold on a second. Are you trying to tell me that some of the French officers didn't have humility? Because I've read a lot of history and I have not heard that before.
I know, it's shocking. I think that is the most shocking thing.
And something else that comes back to, why you wrote this book about when he returns to America years on. You have all of these founding fathers, Hamilton, Jefferson, later on Monroe, who end up hating each other with a absolute passion. And they all love Lafayette, though. And that's what I find very interesting is that it isn't to say none of them realized that he had his faults just like any other human being, but even Jefferson, who I absolutely hate, that's for a different podcast, even Jefferson would say, yeah, the Marquis is like this, but then he has all these wonderful things. Even the worst curmudgeons just really got taken in by him. And do you think it was just the passion? Because, everything we're talking about, he's 19 years old. He has no military experience. He's now a major general because he's super rich. And yet, in any other situation, a person like that would be hated because it seemed like they jumped the line, right?
I think he was acutely aware of his position and how he could remain humble. I think he was a genuine person where he wasn't trying to use these people against each other. He was just devoted to the idea of America. And so all these American friends are what unites them. I'm so impressed by his ability to just remain so close to all these people. Like I'm thinking right now when he writes to Jefferson after the duel with Hamilton and Burr about like, oh, our dear friend Hamilton. And like Jefferson must have gotten that letter and was like, who is he talking about? It's almost like he's unaware of the political infighting that people have there, where he just like, oh, well, I love everyone and everyone must love each other. And I know he doesn't think that way because he's definitely aware of it, but just had this like almost magical kind of way of connecting these men who did not want to sit at the same dinner table. And you see that throughout the tour where you see so many Americans who hated each other coming together for his sake. So it's not just like reserved for like the founders that he has this effect on.
I also love that he is super rich and is not afraid to spend money willy-nilly. Because again, I've always tried to look up and see if I can, with actual numbers, see how rich he was. Because I think it's hard to underestimate how rich he was because of all of the people in his family that just died early from war, disease. He was uber rich. But with the American Revolution, he really actually almost tried to bankrupt himself supporting it, right?
Right. He was almost too generous. And this comes back, especially during the French Revolution, when his assets are seized and he really has nothing. And the remainder of his life, he doesn't have nearly as much as what he was after he was orphaned and he inherited a lot. But he is quick to help. He's like, I may not have experience, but I have cash. And here's what I can offer, which is, I think, another reason why he also maybe initially helped win people over. And then I think people got to know him. And then they're like, oh, okay, he's got the money and he walks the walk, too.
All right, so season 1 is him being young. I think we end it with him getting laughed at by a particular queen that people may have heard of before, Marie Antoinette. We'll end season 1 there. I think we can get 2 seasons out of the American Revolution. But then we have to get to the low light, which is the American Revolution is won. He goes back to France. The French Revolution comes about. Let me ask it this way. If we went to France right now, you and I being so excited, huge fans of the Marquis, and we said to any Frenchman or Frenchwoman, isn't Lafayette awesome? How do you think that they would respond at this point in time?
Oh, the French would definitely respond very differently. Laura Oricchio, who wrote the book Marquis Reconsidered, has this wonderful story in the introduction to her book where she talks about going to Versailles and says that she's writing a book about Lafayette. And the curator is like, why are you writing about Lafayette? You know, there were other Frenchmen who helped. And it's like, you can almost tell that you're an American if you want to know anything about Lafayette when you're in France, which is interesting. And I also think it is a way that the French view historical figures very differently than how Americans do. For Americans, the founding fathers, the Revolutionary era is so much part of our identifying culture. And the French have larger history. They have a different sort of history, and they don't view it the same way as Americans do. That's part of the reason why I think there's kind of they don't care about Lafayette maybe as much as we do in America, but hopefully that's changing. I think this bicentennial of Lafayette's visit is helping to bring things together in true Lafayette fashion, bringing France and America together.
Elizabeth, the French people are just wrong about this. Although I have to admit, when you look at it, and for any listeners, the French Revolution, he is extremely pivotal, but just like basically everyone else, they get eaten alive. When you look at the French Revolution, anyone that got into any place of power fell. And I'd actually say that Lafayette kept his head, which means he's way further ahead than anyone else, pun intended, 100%. But I think, you know, if you end up in prison and your wife has to come chill with you in this very disgusting prison, you probably screwed up a little bit. Yeah,
he kind of had it trying to be more of a centrist coming into this raging revolution France was having, coming with the mindset of like wanting a constitutional monarchy was not going to win him any favors once Robespierre and everyone around him kind of started swinging the needle one drastically different way than how he kind of envisioned the French Revolution to sort of like turn out. He was part of the noble class too, so that is definitely a mark against him. But what I also think is interesting is when he is imprisoned and his astounding wife, who did so much to help him and
don't worry,
we're
going to get to her. We are going to get to her.
Good. Good. When they are imprisoned, one of the many people who helped get them out is Gouverneur Morris. And Gouverneur Morris was not necessarily a fan of Lafayette. He kind of thought he was too kind of jumpy and too energetic. But he's one of the people who helps to get them out. So it's another kind of example of people, even if they may not, like one of the rare people who's very much Americans who's very much against him still is like, all right, we gotta get this guy. He means something more than to be in here.
And ironically, it was over money, wasn't it? Because I think it was Laura, I'm going to say her last name wrong, Oricchio's book. I believe she talks about, or maybe it was a biography of Morris that I'm thinking about, just basically when the Lafayettes lost everything after the revolution, they owed Morris a lot of money. And Adrienne, who we're going to say wonderful things about in a second, not her finest hour, probably said, we actually don't owe you that much because of this. And it seems like that was the final nail in the coffin there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to pay your debts, people. But let's go back to Adrienne. If there is an archetype of a spouse, the perfect spouse who just supportive, forgiving, because let's be honest, he was probably not faithful. And by probably, I mean definitely not. But she supported him. He was barely home for a bunch of years, had to rear kids and deal with the death of children, things like that. She's freaking amazing, right? Like we're going to talk about the Marquis and just keep praising him, but I don't think he can actually do as much as he did unless he had her. What do you think?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. Like it's so much of what he was able to do is because he had her support and unconditional, unwavering support. I mean, for a woman who loses her mother, her grandmother, and her sister during the Reign of Terror to then go and willingly be imprisoned alongside her husband because she knew that he would die if she wasn't there to help him. And that was the only hope that they had is just astounding. And their relationship and their bond is something that is quite admirable. And also, you really don't see it in this time period. There's people who have definitely more partnerships with their spouses, but I think for a noble class in France to have the relationship that the Lafayettes did is pretty remarkable.
Now, I think we're probably at season 5 of this miniseries. So I think season 6, we finally get to your book.
Finally.
All right? He's an aging rock star. And what is America like right now politically? Before they invite Lafayette, just tell me, what's kind of the vibe in the United States right now?
The vibe in 1824 in the United States is where the War of 1812 is over. We're in this era of good feelings with President Monroe, which I always like to say was really the era of bad feelings. There was massive political divisiveness. And also what was coming up is this 50th anniversary of America's birthday, the Declaration of Independence. So that's coming up in 1826. And so Monroe, and looking ahead to wanting to kick off the celebrations of this monumental birthday for the country, is like, okay, we've got to do something that's going to help celebrate this and bring the country together in a way that's unifying. And it's this time that's where a lot of the figures of the revolution are either gone or they're very aged. They're way kind of closer to being gone. And he looks across the ocean and Lafayette is still there. Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, dies in 1808. He's still involved in politics in France. But this is also a good opportunity for him to come back to America. He has not been back since 1784. So it's been 40 years. Monroe writes to him about, hey, do you want to come back and take out this tour of America where people will love to see you and kind of celebrate these upcoming birthday celebrations? And Lafayette's like, of course. And he arrives in August of 1824, starting in New York. And he comes and visits all 24 states in the Union at the time, which was supposed to be a much shorter trip and ends up being a 13-month insane, beyond like even Beatles mania of how people came to visit him and see him just for the chance of maybe even shaking his hand, which has just been astounding.
Well, Elizabeth, it's time for controversial comment number 2, and I'm going to put you right in the line of fire. It's going to happen. I told you it was going to happen. We're going to do it. So I'd like to compare it to something very contemporary. When Lafayette comes back and people want to see him, how would it compare to something like Taylor Swift right now, who can just pack a stadium with seemingly out even trying? What's the comparison there? Is it about the same?
I would say it's about the same, if not greater. I mean, we can only contain Lafayette's to the United States, where the Taylor Swift's Eras Tour is an international phenomenon, but there was merch that was made in cities prior to his arrival so that people, when they're in the crowd, they could be wearing Lafayette ribbons and have Lafayette flags. There are Lafayette gloves where you can have his face imprinted on a glove. People make dresses. It's like there are costumes that people essentially are wearing during these parades, very similar to how people go to Taylor Swift concerts. It's also boosting the economy in the areas that he's visiting. It is one of what I found the most interesting about this is that it is one of the first documented cases of tourism in the United States, where there are, in smaller towns in Virginia, the number of people who came out to see him were larger than the recorded populations of the town. So in an era before trains, obviously before automobiles and like easier ways to get around, people are traveling and making the effort to go and visit, and then the hopes of seeing him in these places, which is, again, very similar to what we see with the Taylor Swift concert. I make the comparison that Lafayette's tour is very similar to the Eras Tour. I also think it's funny that it's also happening around the same time, like 200 years apart. So that's just a fun little added thing too.
Well, I have to think, though, from a logistics perspective, you have a whole bunch of people living out in the wilderness, just camping out in order to see him, because there's no infrastructure yet, especially he's in the National Capital Region, which, if you think D.C. is bad now, back then, still a literal swamp.
Yes.
And then you've already mentioned the rancorous politics, which, thank God, that's gone away. It would be insane to have that many people in any of these cities that just really are not built up enough to support any sort of population.
Right. Especially when he's in DC. He kind of uses DC as his home base for the winter season of 1824 into 1825. He's staying in this area because weather and travel. He's older, getting around by stagecoach and steamboat is not easy. And he'll kind of travel around nearby in the DC area, but from December through March, he's essentially just staying put. And during that time, there is an election that's going on, so there is something that's happening, but it's generally a quieter time. Places that people can book to stay temporarily, and what little infrastructure there was in DC at that time, they are also booked too. So it's like, okay, Lafayette's staying here. Maybe we'll go there in the chance of seeing him, which is just crazy. I chose the DC location for writing the book. There is not really a book that's been written about Lafayette's tour specifically, but I chose the DC region because he did spend about a third of the tour in the greater DC area, which is also, DC didn't exist when he was last in America. So it's kind of this place that's a fruition of what he and Washington fought for, named after Washington, that he gets to use as kind of his home away from home. And he also has a lot of friends in the area that he definitely wants to see. He hasn't seen in 40 years.
So let's go down the list. Who are the most famous people that every American would know that he sees on this tour?
Well, the people he spends definitely the most time with in D.C. specifically are George Washington's step-grandchildren, the Custuses. He is spending really any free time he can get with them. But he also, when he's in Massachusetts, he visits John Adams. He goes and visits Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. He stays a week, 2 weeks down there. He visits James Madison. He's visiting with the widows of these generals and officers who he fought alongside with. Elizabeth Hamilton he goes and sees when he's in New York. So anyone who's anyone is on Lafayette's list of people to spend time with. And if you weren't a name, frequently he would have a time of like open reception at the houses that he was staying where people could come in and like shake his hand, and which I think is really sweet.
Well, my favorite part of the book is he's in these sea of people wherever he goes, but there's one particular point where he looks out into a sea of people and sees specifically a black man. Please tell me that story.
So in Richmond, he is reunited with James Armistead Lafayette. He was enlisted as a spy in the American Revolution, and he was spying, specifically wanted to spy for Lafayette. You could argue, and I put so much of this on James Lafayette's shoulders, that is the reason why we were able to secure the blockade at Yorktown, was thanks to his efforts. Because he was an enslaved man, he was able to go between enemy lines pretty much undetected. The British were like, oh, he's nothing to be a suspect of. And he is deeply instrumental in helping Lafayette. He was not entitled to his freedom because he was not an enlisted soldier. It was under espionage. So when Lafayette comes back to America in 1784, he petitions for James Armistead Lafayette's freedom, which he eventually does earn, and he takes on the surname of Lafayette to honor the man who helped him get his emancipation. So they're reunited in Richmond during the national tour. He was hoping to see him in Yorktown, but James could not get the funds to head that way. So they're reunited in Richmond, completely unexpected. Lafayette is in this carriage. He sees him, he orders the carriage to stop, and they embrace publicly. And this is not the only time Lafayette does this on the tour. He is reunited with James in Richmond, and he also does this in Louisiana, where he recognizes an enslaved man who helped him when he first arrived to America in 1777. And by intentionally doing these in sort of very public manners, he is definitely sending a message. Lafayette's trip was not inherently political, but he is telling people how he feels about, especially the institution of slavery. He was known for having very strong anti-slavery views. And while he doesn't really ever metaphorically pick up the mic and like is yelling at people to abolish the institution of slavery, moments like this is making it very, very clear, especially in southern states, how he feels about this. And he's also very aware that he is the guest of the nation. Nobody's going to stop him. So he's using this kind of advantage that he has and the power that he has to hopefully send a message to the cities and towns and states that he's visiting.
If there wasn't so much research on this, it sounds fake, doesn't it? Like really, like it sounds too perfect, like somebody's writing a novel, but there is so much research, it's happened and all that stuff, but it still sounds unbelievable.
It really does. I had to go back and I'm finding newspaper accounts like the Richmond Inquirer, and I'm like, it's really, and it's recorded in the newspapers of it happening contemporary at the time, and it's really amazing to see, because I feel like we kind of tend to view history in like these chunks where it's like, okay, the revolution happened, and then things were bad, and then we move up to the Civil War, and that's like when there's a lot more push. But no, the abolition and anti-slavery movement is a movement that is there from the start, and it's just continuing to happen, and Lafayette plays a part in it when he's here.
If I can magically send you back in time and let you, I'm going to change it up a little bit, because I am going to ask you about what you would ask the Marquis if you could talk to him. If you could talk to somebody else who knew him and interview them for like an hour, who would it be?
That's a good one. I would love to interview his son. His son's parents sent him to America, where he lived with George Washington during the French Revolution for 2 years. And so he had this paternal relationship with Washington similar to Lafayette, but obviously different generations. And I would just love to know what his experience was when he was here during the Revolution, when he had no idea what really was happening to his family, but he's under the protection of George Washington. And then he comes back with his father in 1824, and what that experience must have been like for him, because so much of the tour, as it should be, the attention is on Lafayette. His son was there with him the entire time as well. So what that must have been like for a different generation, next generation of liberty or the Republic.
Okay, you can talk to the Marquis, but you can only ask him one question. What is it?
Okay, I thought about this. My question is also related to his son, but I would want to ask him, did he ever wish that his son would marry Nellie Custis? When his son was here, there were all these rumors that they were going to be engaged and kind of bring together the Washington and Lafayette families. And she writes to her friend that, like, oh, he's my dear brother George. I could never think of such a thing. But when he comes back with his father in 1824, it seems like she's singing a very different tune. And the letters that she's writing about George, they seem very romantic. They seem very longing. And I would love to know what, if anything, kind of was going on during that.
That's much better than what I came up with, which I was just going to ask him for money.
Oh, well, that's a good one, too. Yeah, he probably would have given it to you.
He probably would. That's the best part, right? So, Elizabeth, I love the book, but there are these poor misguided souls that we talk about every episode that think history is super boring, okay? If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I read your book? What would you say?
Well, whenever I interact with someone who says history is boring, or I'll hear when I give tours, I wish you were my history teacher, I ask if their history teacher was someone who just made them remember dates. And they usually say yes. And I said, when you look beyond the dates, the dates don't matter. They do matter, but we live in a world where looking up something has never been easier. So knowing a date of something, I admit I'm terrible with dates. When I'm speaking, I like, oh, in the mid-19th century is much easier than saying like a specific date. But if you look beyond that and you look at the stories of these people, because we think our own lives are interesting to some degree, like we're invested in the drama of what's going on in our life, what's going on in other people's lives. We have reality TV shows. This is just a different way of sort of looking at it. What I find the most interesting about people is it's the history, is that it's the study of people and how people have changed and how people have really stayed the same. And what I found so interesting about Lafayette's tour is it not only has so many political, social, cultural parallels to what's going on in America today, but the idea of these people just wanting to be a part of something and wanting to say that they saw this man who had such an impact on American liberty and freedom and had a hand in helping us win the American Revolution. Something that's a little bit bigger than themselves is what I was hoping to kind of talk about when writing this book, and how these lingering feelings continue through the years. So if you're interested in the study and interested in people and interested in people's behaviors, you're interested in history, you just got to give it a shot. Don't worry about dates. You can look them up.
Let me add one more thing, too. It's only 160 pages.
I wrote it so that it was accessible for people who knew everything about Lafayette, who knew nothing about Lafayette, as a way to be not so intimidating. Because I know what it can be like to pick up a big book and be like, oh my gosh, it's not the Power Broker. You can get through it in like a sitting or two.
Anybody could do 160 pages. Elizabeth, this was an absolute thrill for me. I think that's pretty obvious. The book is wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on to talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. That's it for season 3. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Marquis de Lafayette returns. Great short book for somebody who maybe doesn't know they love history yet. Give them this, they can knock it out, and then they're going to realize that they do. Thank you so much for listening this year. Whatever you're celebrating in the next few weeks, I hope it's happy. Have a happy new year, and we will see you January 15th with season 4. Until then, stay cool, nerds.
History Nerds United.